Hello, and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. We stand at a milestone in history. 2 years after the October 7th attacks, after 2 years of an exhausting, frustrating, multi-front war, President Donald Trump appears to have succeeded at pushing Israel and Hamas into an agreement to end the conflict. But even as we hope and pray that the war is finally over, we know that the road to healing is not going to be easy. And some of the changes that the Gaza war has caused will be with us for a very long time, if not permanently. Just before the announcement of the Trump deal, my colleague, Haaretz Jewish World editor Judy Maltz, undertook a special project for our website as part of our coverage marking 2 years since October 7th. Her project? A global survey of Jewish students around the world who were on campus on October 7th and lived there throughout its aftermath. As those of us who have been to university know, it's usually a transformative time of life that provides many of the building blocks for our views and identity. For young Jews around the world, that includes their Jewish identity and their relationship to the Jewish state. Judy spoke with 13 university students from various countries and very different backgrounds about their feelings about the war, about the campus protests, about antisemitism, and how it all changed the way that they felt about being Jewish and about Israel. The voices of the young Jews that Judy spoke to, and my conversation with Judy on the often surprising and contradictory things they had to say are coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Judy Maltz, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Allison.
Judy, we've all seen and read about the pro-Palestinian protests that erupted on campuses around the world after the Hamas attack of October 7th. We know that Jewish students have said that they have felt threatened, unsafe. Some felt pushed to defend Israel. Others felt a moral obligation to join the critics. You went out there and asked them questions about their views, the campus atmosphere, how the war affected their relationships with their Jewish and non-Jewish classmates, and whether those views evolved over the past 2 years. And of course, how it affected the way they feel about their Judaism, about antisemitism, and clearly about Israel. So, Judy, for a project that commemorates the second anniversary of October 7th, you could have gone in any direction. You could have looked at any angle. So I'm wondering, why did you choose this particular demographic, college students?
As you know, Allison, on October 7th, I had just arrived in New York. I was on assignment for Haaretz, and I ended up spending a lot of time that week and later that year on the campus of Columbia University. Not only Columbia, I was also at quite a number of campuses, but I guess you could say that Columbia was the flashpoint. It was where, the most extreme things were happening. And a year later, I spent a semester on the Berkeley campus, which was also a hotbed of these sorts of activities. And so I spent a lot of time during that year and a half talking to Jewish students about what they were going through in the immediate aftermath, and also that academic year, which was a very, very unusual academic year in America, probably the most explosive year on campuses since 1968 and the Vietnam War. And I heard lots of different things from Jewish students that year. So I was very curious now that time has passed and we've approached the 2-year mark. And so much has changed since October 7th, 2023. And all of us have changed and our feelings have changed about what happened and this war. And I just figured of all the groups of Jewish people that I had met who had been affected by this, it was this age group, those students who had been on campus on October 7th, 2023, and that year when everything exploded. I wanted to know now what had changed in them. How had this affected them, shaped their views about Israel, about being Jewish? Because, now we have not only the events of that week, but there's the whole war. And even in Israel, public opinion has changed so much about this war. And aside from that, there's been the anti-Semitism, which was just starting then. And we know we've seen anti-Semitism not only in the United States, but in countries like where we've never witnessed it before, Canada, Australia. And I was very curious to find out also how much, if at all, these students who had experienced anti-Semitism for the first time in their lives, many of them, whether or not they were blaming Israel for this, the actions of the government, the army. So that's how the idea was generated.
So Jewish students worldwide is a big pool to choose from. Obviously, you wanted a lot of English-speaking students because we're Haaretz English. Were you looking for young diaspora Jews with a certain political orientation? And you made a point of interviewing people who were no longer students. They had already graduated. So why did you do that?
That was like the first thing I thought about. I want people who are out of college now because I wanted them to have that distance from the experience so that they could have, I'm assuming that they had time to process it. They were away from campus now. And as you know, in life, when you go away from something that's been very traumatizing or very transformational, sometimes you need time to process it. So I figured if I have students who've already graduated, they've had that time to think about how it's affected them. And in answer to your question about whether I was looking for a certain type, no, not at all, actually. I wanted to hear as many different voices as possible. That was the whole point of this. There was certainly no agenda here. And basically, I turned to people I knew in all these Jewish communities. And fortunately, I've traveled quite a bit, thanks to my job. And I have contacts in Jewish communities in all these places, and I asked for references. And really what I was asking for is find me somebody who was in university that year, is no longer, and is also thoughtful and articulate. And I don't really care what they think, but I want them to be thoughtful.
Were they eager to be heard? Were they reluctant to go on record?
It was very difficult in many cases to find students who were willing to speak on the record, not only with their full name, but also to have their photograph on our website and in the paper. I had one student, for example, who provided me with an interview, sent photos, and then called a few days later and said, please do not publish this. I think my family will be very, very upset if they find out I've become an anti-Zionist. Yeah. And, there's so much sensitivities around this now in the whole issue of doxing.
Young people looking for jobs, yeah.
Exactly. That was another person who said, look, this person hadn't given me an interview, but we spoke about it and said, does my name have to be in it? And I said, yes. And this person said, well, then I can't do it because I don't want anyone to look up my name and find what my views are on this conflict.
So with that, let's listen to some of the voices of your interviewees. We'll start with Maya Cristal, 22 years old. She graduated from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in spring 2024.
In the direct aftermath, I was definitely really distracted. It was hard to focus on my classes. I actually one of the things that kind of stands out for me in that period is that right after I had assignments in 2 classes that were due that I still needed to work on, and I reached out to those professors and asked for extensions, and they were wonderful professors, and they gave me those extensions. And the thing about that really stands out to me is that one of those, I think actually both of those professors followed up with me throughout the semester and checked in to see how I was doing, how my family, because I mentioned that I had family in Israel, to see if my family was safe. And that was really incredibly helpful and supportive for me. I think the other thing about that is one of those professors was also actually a member of Faculty for Justice in Palestine. And so it gave me kind of an understanding I think some of my peers at Hillel didn't share, of the people who were protesting, who were part of the encampments. A lot of people at Hillel thought that they didn't care about Israelis or that they viewed all Jews as bad. But I think especially that interaction with that professor, along with a host of other things, helped me to know that these people aren't an enemy. These people aren't out to get me, but they're reacting to an injustice that they're seeing.
I think that experience was even transformational for her. In the end, she became involved in all sorts of leftist groups on campus. She was actually working in the Hillel. And since graduating, she's become involved in one of the American chapters of Standing Together, which is an organization that brings together Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and Arabs in Israel. And so it definitely had quite an effect on her.
And then in the United Kingdom, there's Louis Greengrass, 22 years old, graduated from the University of Bristol in spring 2025.
Initially, the idea of kind of Israel going in, there had to be some consequence, right? And so I think that personally, like, support for the legitimacy of the war was always there, because the purpose was clear to me and the rationale was clear. And I think what's changed for me over 2 years, broadly speaking, is kind of 2 things. Is one is the way that Israel has gone about doing the war has changed my opinion on its legitimacy. And then also I struggle to see the ongoing need for the war, in that I'm of the belief that whether or not that the idea of destroying Hamas, I don't think is a thing that can ever happen.
So Louis's experience was a little different, right, Judy?
Yeah, Louis, I don't know that he grew up in an Orthodox home, but his family definitely belonged to an Orthodox congregation in London. And the way he explains it, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, he, like most Jews everywhere in the world, was very concerned about what happened in Israel and was very supportive of Israel's decision to go to war in Gaza. But as time went on, he definitely changed his views a lot, and he has really distanced himself from Israel as a result. He did not, according to his testimony, he did not experience any anti-Semitism on campus. He says he actually served as a bridge on campus between many of his Jewish friends who were kind of skeptical, the non-Jews on campus, especially those who were involved in the Palestinian Solidarity movement, and friends he had who were active in the pro-Palestinian movement. But something that sticks with me that he said, he was recently in Israel. He has family in Israel, as many Jews do. And he says he was in Jerusalem and he saw a sign on a building somewhere in the city that says, "Make Gaza Jewish now." And for him, it just demonstrated how distant Israel and its values had had come from him. And so I guess you could say he's a good example of a young Jew in the diaspora who, because of this war, especially in the past year, has really felt increasingly alienated from Israel.
Another interviewee lives in a country considered very hostile to Israel right now, South Africa. It's leading the charge in international courts, accusing Israel of war crimes. And this student you spoke to was Ruby Kapelushnik, 22 years old, graduated from the University of Cape Town in fall 2024.
The way that the campus handled it was really disappointing. They didn't provide that much support to us, house students. They didn't follow any of the protocol when the other students were going against there's very specific rules that are laid out. But UCT really handled it terribly. It doesn't surprise me. They wanted to do an academic boycott. That's what they're trying to do at the moment against Israel, and trying to cut ties with any academic work that's been done in partnership. So it doesn't surprise me that UCT handled this so badly, but it was very difficult.
So how did Ruby react to what was going on around her?
So Ruby, unlike most of the other students that I spoke to, actually had a student leadership position at her university. She was vice chair of the old SOJUS, South African Union of Jewish Students. And she arrived on campus a few days after October 7th. Let's not forget that October 7th was on a Saturday, so it was a few days until classes started. She arrived on campus. She said she was in shock. People who had been friends simply refused to talk to her. She said she didn't understand what she had done. And remember, this is still before Israel had gone into Gaza. And she spent that year as a Jewish student leader really supporting Jewish students on campus who are having a very, very difficult time. And as you said, South Africa wasn't an easy place for, I would say, supporters of Israel. I don't want to say Jews, for supporters of Israel even before October 7th, but much more so after, at least according to her. But so two interesting things she said. You would have thought that someone who experienced what she did would probably have grown stronger in her support of Israel because she was attacked as a Jew and as an Israel supporter in the beginning. But in fact, quite the opposite. She went through a similar process as Lewis did, who we spoke about just before. And she, too, has started to become angry. I don't know if angry is the correct word, but to have very strong reservations about what Israel, the Israeli government, the Israeli army were doing in Gaza. The other interesting thing is that you would think, after all she went through, and it seems like a pretty horrible experience from the way she described it, that she would wonder what her future in South Africa was as a young Jewish woman who's still a Zionist, even if she does not agree with the Israeli government. But she is gung-ho to stay there and turn South Africa into a better country. And she says she would never dream of leaving South Africa.
And finally, Judy, someone who was with you in the eye of the storm on the Columbia University campus, Jacob Schmeltz, age 23. He graduated in spring 2024, so he must have had a very powerful experience. Here he is talking about it and how it affected him.
At Columbia, there were already demonstrations breaking out on campus less than 5 days after October 7th, and I felt very strongly that the Jewish community at Columbia was not given the opportunity to grieve the loss of our friends and family members and all of those affected, and we were not given the deference to discuss and really process our emotions on such a large and really distressing event. I mean, clearly when there are calls for violence and very strong rhetoric on campus before any military operation in Gaza had begun, I think that really showed what life would be like for many Jewish students in Columbia for the rest of the year, unfortunately.
So, Judy, how did the encampment battle, police all over campus affect Jacob?
Jacob was an active member of Democrats at Columbia before October 7th. He was very political. He calls himself a liberal Zionist. He says, I have not changed at all. Everybody else has changed. I've stayed where I always was. I believe in the need for a Jewish state. I also believe there needs to be a two-state solution if that Jewish state is going to survive, he says. And I still believe that, even today. What happened with Jacob, which is really interesting, is that was so impacted by what happened in the campus there that he's decided to go in a completely different career direction. He was originally planning to go to law school and go into some career where he said that involves the intersection of law and politics.
He's had enough of politics.
Now he is actually thinking about doing graduate work in Jewish history. He is fascinated. The thing he went through on the campus in the history of anti-Semitism in America.
Really interesting. Really interesting. I wonder what his parents think.
He's teaching in a public school in Newark, New Jersey as part of the Teach for America. So you can see he's a very idealistic kind of kid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Judy, what surprised you about the responses you heard, and what didn't surprise you? What did you expect?
So what surprised me was, in a number of cases, I have more than one person from a country talking about their experiences. For example, Australia, I had two, and South Africa I had. And even though these were Jewish students who had been on campus on October 7th, in the exact same country, the experience was completely different. They were not on the same campus, I should say that. But still, it's the same country. So in Australia, we have one guy who was at the University of Sydney who had such a horrific experience that he's making Aliyah at the end of the year. He's leaving Australia. He says, Australia is no longer my home. We have another guy who's in the University of Monash in Melbourne who's, I don't understand why everyone thinks that there's so much anti-Semitism in Australia. Everyone I talk to from Israel is like, how are you guys doing? And he's like, there's not really anti-Semitism here. I've never encountered it. Neither has anybody I know. So, go figure. Two people from the same country. Same thing with South Africa. I told you about Ruby and what she experienced as a Jewish student leader. I had another young woman who's a graduate of WITS in Johannesburg. She said, no bad experience whatsoever. She stood in the streets with her Israeli flag demonstrating with hostage families. Nothing, just thumbs up from people. Same country, so that surprised me.
So anyone saying universally Jewish students felt threatened and unsafe is making a tremendous assumption and generalization. Did you find students who actually felt threatened and unsafe?
There were a few, yeah. There was a guy from the University of Cincinnati who was in a frat house at the time, and the frat house was egged, and even worse things happened. And he went to the school administration, he went to the police. Nobody wanted to help him. He eventually moved out into a Jewish frat. Things were that bad. There was the guy I mentioned from Australia who's making Aliyah, who said people who were sitting next to him in class who he thought were his friends, he found out these were people who had gone to that crazy rally. I don't know if you remember, it was like the day after.
At the Opera House.
At the Opera House. And like, how can I go back after that? These were supposed to be my friends. So there were people, and there was an interesting case of a young woman who grew up in Portland, Oregon, a progressive capital of America, in a very liberal home. She said growing up, she always felt conflicted about Zionism. But she said after October 7th, she used to always poo-poo anti-Semitism, and she said, now I realize I was wrong. She also experienced for the first time in her life anti-Semitism, and she was at Brandeis.
Judy, overall, would you say that these students reported that their views evolved and transformed over the 2 years, or did they report themselves as feeling similarly 2 years later as to the way that they felt on October 7th? If you were making a sweeping generalization, would you say for each of these students or most of these students, it was a personally transformative and changing experience?
It was definitely a very changing experience for all of them, each in their own way. If there was anything common that came out through all the conversations, again, it wasn't 100%, but a vast majority of them, I would say that on October 8th, October 9th, were very supportive of Israel and very, very troubled and distressed by what happened and supported the Israeli incursion into Gaza. Now, I did not find even one who could say wholeheartedly that they supported the continuation of this war. And I should say that among the group, there were quite a few who were Orthodox. And we know that the Orthodox in general tend to be more supportive of the government. So even those Orthodox university graduates have issues with what is happening in Israel right now.
Judy, one last self-indulgent question. We both have kids who are about the age of the students that you interviewed, and many of them are students themselves. They're slightly older because of the requirement that Israelis serve in the army before they go to university. Did anything in particular strike you, noting the differences between the way that your interviewees think and talk about the war and the ways that their generation in Israel thinks and talks about the war?
That's a great question. Well, our kids are older, though, Allison, and our kids are also after being in the army, and I have a son who was also most of his second year in university here spent on reserve duty. So I don't even know if our kids have had as much time to reflect. I think in general, the young generation in Israel, they tend to accept this war as kind of a fact. And I mean, now we're seeing reservists who are coming out against the war, but that's taken quite a bit of time for that to happen. And I think one of the first things I noticed when you started going to the protests after the war, one of the big differences in the protests after the war and the mass protests against the judicial overhaul before the war, was that suddenly you didn't really see young people anymore. They were a very, very big part of the protests before October 2023. And then they disappeared. And I think they disappeared. A lot of them were on reserve duty and just weren't available. But also, they weren't as quick as their parents, I think, to question the legitimacy of the war and what the government was doing.
So even among young, relatively secular, relatively leftist people, 20-somethings, we can conclude maybe that the divide between Israelis and diaspora Jews when it comes to issues like this is growing wider.
Absolutely.
Judy, amazing work. We've only given a taste of some of your interviews, so I highly recommend that everybody go to Haaretz.com and look at your entire project. Very interesting with a lot of maps and graphics and everything. Great job. Thanks for doing it, Judy, and thanks for coming on the podcast, as always.
And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it, Allison.
And that wraps things up for this episode of the Haaretz podcast. Thanks to my guest, Judy Maltz, and to producer and editor, Nara Malkin. If you want to continue to listen to the podcast, make sure you never miss an episode. Please subscribe to us on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're so inclined, leave us a 5-star rating. That way more people will find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, including Judy's article, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.